It's a real pleasure to be here, particularly to be in Semarang. I met several of the Semarang city team in Bonn several years ago. I read about your city, but it's very special to be here this evening. And it's a delight to see so many new faces as well as so many old friends. The warmth that exists in this room, the community that exists, is something very special. And several years ago at one of these events, I was talking to Deborah Roberts, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, and I said, you know you're part of something good when it grows like a snowball. No one leaves. The community just keeps getting bigger and bigger. They move from one organization to another, but we all knew from the outset that we were onto a good thing or an important thing as part of ACCCRN. It's been a difficult journey, but it's been a worthwhile journey. And it's only occasionally in life that you have the opportunity to be part of an important agenda that can shape the future. And I think everyone involved in ACCCRN has been part of an important agenda that is shaping the future. I've been asked to talk about why urban climate change resilience, the rather bad acronym UCCR, is relevant. The simple answer is that it brings together two issues that are likely to determine the future of the world's population. That might sound a bit dramatic, but I think it's very real. What do we mean by the future? My father was 84 when he died 14 years ago. I will be 84 in 2050, which is as far into the future as I can see, and I have little doubt that urban climate change resilience is going to become an increasingly important agenda over the coming decades and beyond 2050. But I'd like to start by looking back to when ACCCRN began 8 years ago. I think my qualifications for actually standing on this platform is that I think I'm the oldest, not in age, but in time, the oldest serving member of the ACCCRN community, along with Anna, who I met in Bellagio in 2007 at a seminar that the Rockefeller Foundation organized to talk about cities and climate change. It was, in fact, an event that had two tracks. I was in the Global South track, along with some inspiring people like David Satterthwaite from IIED, Salim Hook from ICAD, and Deborah Roberts from the city of Durban, who have continued to champion climate change in the Global South. But up the hill in the other villa was a different group of people who primarily came from North America, a few from Europe. And there was one evening we met all together. And on that evening, we realized that there were two very different views of climate change in the world. For people living in the Global South and in Asia, particularly, it was already a reality. Whereas for people living in North America, it was riddled with skepticism. So what's changed over the last 8 years? What's changed is that the voice of climate change skeptics globally, notably in the United States and Australia, and I'm sorry to pick on people who come from those countries, has finally been drowned out by the growing body of scientific and empirical evidence. At COP21 last year, a consensus was finally reached amongst the world's leaders about the significance of climate change and the necessity for action, both to contain the degree of global warming to less than 2 degrees. I wish it was lower, but it was probably the best we can do now, and the need for significant investment to combat potential impacts. Asian cities, perhaps more so than in any other part of the world, are taking the threat of climate change seriously and pioneering the way. I think that's because in Asia so many cities are coastal, so many cities are exposed to sea level rise and typhoons, to urban flooding and to heat waves. Oops. And I also in this region, I realized that food and water scarcity concerns about crop failure, fish stocks failing are an increasing concern. But other things have changed. When we did the scoping exercise for ACCCRN, which was done jointly by Arup, Taru and ICLEI, we engaged with various cities to decide where ACCCRN wanted to start. And the thing that was astonishing is that even then, when climate impact seemed real, the people we spoke to in government felt that climate change was associated solely with greenhouse gas emissions. Climate change then was purely about mitigation. The world believed that it was a problem that we could fix. Now it's a problem that we have to live with. The mitigation agenda has absolutely not gone away. But as a result, starting from the Bali conference in 2008, which coincided with the beginning of ACCCRN, adaptation crept onto the agenda. Programs such as PACLIM in Indonesia, which was solely focused on mitigation, started to be working alongside the ACCCRN program, which was thinking about adaptation. And this new word, resilience, was creeping in. But we weren't really sure then what it meant. I'll come back to that later. It's not just our awareness of climate change that's increased, it's our awareness of cities. Again, if I go back 8 years, I began most of my talks trying to convince people that we were living in an urban world, that there was a significant shift going on because 50% of the world's population were now living in cities. By 2050, it's going to be 75%. It's now accepted that the way in which cities develop will define our future. And this is particularly true in Asia and Africa, where much of the urbanization has yet to happen. And over the next 20 years, we have an opportunity to actually create a different future. In up until about 2010, we also globally were living in a rather false belief that cities were simply places of economic opportunity. They attracted people because of the good things that happened in cities. And that's still very true. But then the World Disasters Report in 2010 actually focused on pointing out that while cities are attractive as centres of opportunity, there are also places where risks accumulate and extreme events can result in significant losses. The following year, I gave a global lecture series, the Brunel Lecture, called Shifting Agendas from Response to Resilience. It was really about cities, about the uncertainty, about the complexity, about the fact that we were facing an uncertain future. When I started that lecture series, people said, "What are you talking about? This is doom and gloom." But by the time I finished it, 2 years later, we'd seen significant events: Superstorm Sandy in America, the floods that affected 2 million people in Bangkok. There was flooding in Brisbane, in Pakistan, last year in Mumbai. Only a few days ago, in northwest India, the highest ever temperature was recorded in a city, in a heat wave. So the vulnerability to climate-related hazards is now accepted in a way that it wasn't when the ACCCRN program started. But perhaps the most important thing that's happened is the voice of cities collectively, as a collective voice, has emerged. Their unquestionable role in tackling climate change was recognized at COP21. It was the first time that cities came en masse to a big UN gathering. It was not only the unquestionable role they play in tackling climate change, but also their willingness to be part of the solution that was notable. It was illustrated by initiatives, including the C40 cities, the 100 Resilient Cities, the Compact of Mayors, ICLEI's work, and of course, ACCCRN. Collectively, cities represent a new voice in the debate and a powerful force for change. But what is UCCR? And what's different about it? Why is it relevant? Why is it important? Why is it game-changing? Last time I was in Indonesia was 5 years ago, in February 2011, for the first ACCCRN Knowledge Forum in Bali. Many others here were also there. Would you like to raise your hands? So this was the size of the community then and how much it's grown. At that time, many of us were struggling to think about cities as systems, to understand what resilience meant, to translate it into our local language, to move beyond disaster risk reduction. As Bart said just before I walked in there, Joe, all that is now old hat. 5 years on, and it's only 5 years ago, urban climate change resilience is increasingly being used to describe the ability of cities to persist in the face of the multiple threats posed by climate change. Conceptually, it's recognized that we can't accurately predict how these threats will unfold, both due to the complexity of cities, the pace of urbanization, and the uncertainty as to how fast mitigation efforts will prove effective. But nevertheless, urban climate change resilience is taking hold. We recently completed some work for the Asia Development Bank, and we interviewed 40 key stakeholders across 7 cities in 7 countries, asking them what UCCR meant to them, whether it mattered. The conclusion was that it's an important agenda that offers opportunity to address climate risk holistically, to go beyond climate change adaptation as an isolated agenda. Resilience, whether you're thinking about it at a community scale, a city scale, a national scale, is increasingly being recognized as combining 3 things: the capacity to prepare and withstand for sudden shocks, concepts that are very familiar to us from disaster risk reduction, the need to adapt progressively as stresses accumulate, but importantly, the opportunity that pressures provide to think differently, adopt new strategies, and transform. As I often say, some of the greatest cities in the world, including London, where I live, have actually been shaped by the stresses that have happened to them. We had the plague several centuries ago, which is what triggered us to tackle our sewage issue. We had chronic air pollution, and that actually caused us to change the way we use energy to power London. It's actually pressures that create change. And so we need to think of UCCR as a really proactive development agenda. It's something that changes people's lives positively. It's not a defensive action. And it's that opportunity for transformation that's exciting and why I continue to be passionate about it. It's not an isolated agenda. It's actually an opportunity to tackle the failures of the urban development to date. Approaches that have resulted in urban poverty, environmental degradation, and unsustainable development, characterized by waste, pollution, and congestion. We haven't got it right so far, and perhaps climate change is the catalyst that will force us to adopt new approaches. These issues are the same ones that are compounding climate change. We know that within a city, the impacts of climate change are experienced unequally. Poor elderly women, migrant workers with limited access to basic services are more prone to disease and more likely to be living on marginalized land exposed to flooding. Contamination of natural water sources, the concreting over of green spaces, the destruction of coastal ecosystems has progressively eroded our natural capital, compounding the risk of flooding, water scarcity, poor air quality. The need for new approaches to urban development that are integrated and are inclusive are reflected in the Sustainable Development Goals. And whereas the Millennium Development Goals recognized there was a problem in terms of global poverty and assumed it could be fixed, the Sustainable Development Goals actually set out an agenda for the future which is inclusive, it leaves no one behind, and it recognizes the very critical role that cities play. Goal 11 is about cities being safe, resilient, sustainable, and inclusive. It provides a holistic goal that has global consensus that every city can strive for. In my own organization, I'm challenging every project that we do in urban areas to demonstrate how they are contributing to that goal. This will be further elaborated in October in the new urban agenda being proposed at Habitat 3. And all of this is closely aligned with the critical aspects of UCCR that I'll come on to. New approaches to urban planning and governance are needed if we're going to achieve Goal 11. I believe that UCCR, coined by ACCCRN, is actually part of a paradigm shift that is going on globally, that moves us beyond development as usual. Development as usual being focused on economic growth and prosperity at the expense of social inclusion or sustainable development. UCCR is an approach that not only will create more resilient cities to climate change, it will create cities that are inherently more inclusive and more sustainable. And this is because urban climate change resilience recognises the importance of ecosystems, the quality of infrastructure. It recognises that we need integrated planning, that green and blue infrastructure, climate-proofing infrastructure, and environmental management are all critical aspects of urban management. ACCCRN has highlighted the need to revert to historical planning approaches to settlements, founded on an understanding of hydrology, catchment areas, water sources, storage and attenuation, rather than thinking about transport systems and buildings, what I call roads and nodes. UCCR recognises the importance of integrated rather than siloed sectoral planning. Likewise, the cumulative impact of smaller scale interventions, rainwater harvesting, green roofs, cool roofs, that will enable people to live with nature rather than try and keep nature out. Urban climate change resilience also recognises the need for collective action by all those with a vested interest in the future, from residents to governments, businesses to service providers, at household, community and city scale, within both formal and informal settlements and sectors. And central to this is information and knowledge and inclusive governments that meaningfully engages with a range of actors, understanding their perspectives of risk and their capacity to act. ACCCRN has repeatedly demonstrated that value, the value of shared learning and of learning by doing, of working together, breaking down barriers, offering new insights and possibilities. Whether that was in Hat Yai and Surat, where the Chamber of Commerce played a critical role working with a diverse role of actors, or in Chiang Rai, where the NGOs, government and academic institutions joined forces at the start of ACCCRN on the sector studies. The advantage of this approach, which IIED are referring to as adaptive governance in their forthcoming book based on ACCCRN, is that it offers flexibility and capacity to be resourceful and responsive. And it offsets some of the resource and capacity challenges that many municipalities face, brokering the dynamics of people, politics, and power. The third thing that UCCRN recognises is the importance of evidence and knowledge to inform learning and action. The papers published by IIED that many of you have written, some of which feature in their forthcoming book, provide an extraordinarily rich analysis of the diversity of approaches that ACCCRN set out to explore. Importantly, to people like me who live the other side of the world, they provide evidence, factual and anecdotal, of the myriad of factors affecting vulnerability and the barriers to action. For people sitting in DC, making decisions for the World Bank or USAID, they make climate change resilience real. ACCCRN has adopted an approach to building urban climate change resilience that's founded on the pillars of shared learning through multi-stakeholder processes and scientific knowledge based on climate modelling and sector studies. Secondly, on articulating integrated urban resilience strategies as a stepping stone to defining and prioritising action. These approaches are echoed in 100 Resilient Cities methodology globally. They've been picked up by the World Bank in their city strength. They've informed Ho Chi Minh's AAA approach to climate change adaptation, assessment, adaptation, action. These key themes that have emerged from ACCCRN were also echoed in the research that we carried out in 22 cities globally in developing the City Resilience Index. Even though climate change wasn't the specific focus, and our aim was to diagnose to what extent a city is resilient rather than to build resilience, we found the same things to be important. Notably, the health and well-being of everyone, infrastructure and ecosystems that protect us and enable us to access essential services and goods, service and people and information to flow, and governance characterized by inclusion, integration and iterative learning. I began by looking back at what's changed over the last 8 years as a context to reflecting on what everyone in ACCCRN has achieved over this period, and I believe the considerable influence that ACCCRN has had, not just on the Rockefeller Foundation, but on numerous other key players in this space. USAID, the World Bank, DFID, and my own organisation, Arup, where city resilience is now one of 5 critical urban agendas that we've identified globally. I'd like to end by looking 8 years hence to 2024 or perhaps 2025, when a further 100 million or so people will be living in cities in Asia. The pace of urbanization in this region is a one-off opportunity to tackle climate change that everyone needs to grab. ACCCRN has focused on second-tier cities, which I believe is incredibly important. It's where the majority of urbanization over the next decade will take place. Already ACCCRN's reached 50 cities, but there are many more whose populations will double in the next 15 years with growth rates of 5 to 6%. And it's not just in Asia, it's in Africa, where much of my work is today. These smaller cities are important because they face common challenges. In addition to the real or potential impacts of climate change, they include what we call now issues, immediate issues around informal growth, spatially and economically, the amount of new infrastructure required and the investment required to realise it, the decentralisation of authority to municipalities, not necessarily with matching resources. That itself is a very real issue in Africa. The definition of urban climate change resilience that has emerged as a result of ACCCRN is not just about climate risk, it's also about tackling these development challenges, to realise what the Rockefeller Foundation refers to as the resilience dividend. The pace of urbanisation in this region, the need for significant investment in infrastructure, and the increasing availability of climate finance through DFID's International Climate Fund, the Green Climate Fund, the urban, I can never do this, UCCR, run by the ADB, offers a unique opportunity to tackle today's challenges and be prepared for what's to come. The relevance of urban climate change resilience is that it's part of the new urban agenda. It recognises the quality of urban development and governance is key not only to prosperity and well-being, but the ability to survive and thrive, leaving no one behind. As a result of the hard work over the last 8 years, the knowledge exists, the community of practitioners exist to take this agenda forwards. We have much to learn from each other, much to share, and unfortunately still much to do. I congratulate you all on what you've achieved to date and wish you good luck for the future. Thank you.